Peter, I know you have a very different take on the economy from the rest of this panel. I want to broach the subject by first making a plug for my organization. This is the cover of the New Atlantic. It says The Hero, and the hero on the cover is Ben Bernanke. Peter, in the green room, just outside there, you told me, and I believe this was on the record, it is now.
My criticism of the Fed is always on the record.
I think I got signed off. If it was my contractual obligation to do everything possible to wreck this economy, what I would do is go back and follow every single thing that Ben Bernanke, the hero, the Atlantic on book stands, did in the last 3 years. Explain that.
Sure. You know, first of all, too, you mentioned that you think the government needs to protect investors. Investors need protection from government. They need protection from people like Ben Bernanke. I mean, he is the greatest threat to American investors. He's got interest rates artificially low, which is robbing savers of their return. He's destroying the value of our currency, the dollar. The government is forcing Americans to participate in the world's biggest Ponzi scheme. I mean, so we need to be protected from government, not the other way around. But the reason that I'm criticizing Ben Bernanke is, you know, rather than learning from the mistakes of his predecessor, Alan Greenspan, he's just repeating them on a bigger scale. Greenspan's policies created the housing bubble. Yes, Fannie and Freddie, government-created entities, were part of the problem. But take the Fed out of the picture, take those artificially low interest rates, that 1% Fed funds rate that we had for years, we never would have inflated this bubble. We never would have had subprime. We never would have had teaser rates on adjustable rate mortgages. All this was a creation of the Fed. And the Fed made these mistakes to try to artificially stimulate the economy from the recession we had in 2001. And when Greenspan's bubble burst in 2008, and we had that financial crisis, which was clearly a creation of government, what did Ben Bernanke do? Did he learn from the mistakes? No. Not only did he not raise interest rates to 1%, he brought them to 0. Even people that didn't see the financial crisis coming, and this conference is full of economists who missed it, right? Even some of those will say that part of the problem was that the Fed kept interest rates for too low for too long. Well, what is Bernanke doing? Keeping them at 0 even longer? And they just announced these phony stress tests that came out there in the papers today. The Federal Reserve asked the banks to run these stress tests. Well, under the stress tests, the assumption is that interest rates stay at 0 and that the 10-year Treasury yield stays below 2%. Now, why didn't the Fed ask the banks to run a stress test on a return to normal interest rates? The reason is because all those banks would fail. Ben Bernanke has got the whole economy hooked now on cheap credit, and it's masquerading as economic growth. If you look at the trade deficit that came out last week, it's exploding. The current account deficit is getting bigger. The jobs that we're creating now are making us poorer, not richer. What we need for economic growth is savings, is investment, and production. We're not getting that. All we're doing is spending borrowed money. And yeah, when you spend borrowed money, you can temporarily create some jobs, like we created some jobs during the housing bubble. But when that bubble bursts, all those jobs disappear, and what you're left with is a gigantic hole, which is what we're digging for ourselves right now. So this panel is about growth. We don't have any growth, right? Our economy is actually getting sicker because Ben Bernanke refuses to allow the cure. What we need is higher interest rates. The biggest problem in this country is that rates are too low. The federal government has price-fixed interest rates. It's not letting the market determine interest rates. So because interest rates are too low, Americans spend too much, they consume too much, they don't save enough, they don't invest enough, and the government is enormous. If you want to know why the budget deficits are so big, it's because of Ben Bernanke. If he did his job, right, if he let interest rates go up and refused to monetize government debt, Congress would have no choice but to cut spending. But because Ben Bernanke gives them a way out, he gives them an easy way out because he buys all that paper, the government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But these same mistakes took place in Europe. I mean, we're looking at what's happening in Greece right now. A few years ago, Greece had very, very low interest rates, almost as low as ours. And then they went up because Greece's creditors got worried that they weren't going to get paid back. Well, we can't pay our creditors back either. And pretty soon they're going to figure it out. And people think, well, we're different than Greece because we got a printing press. Well, Zimbabwe has a printing press. Having a printing press doesn't make things better. It makes it worse. What good is it if you get your money back and it has no value? But that is the crisis that we're heading for. We're going to have a sovereign debt crisis, a currency crisis, and this next collapse that's coming, and it's not years and years away, it's coming soon, is going to be much worse than what happened in 2008.
Thanks, Peter.
I will take a manufacturing job against 2 service jobs anytime. Anytime.
Let me say something about manufacturing.
Sure.
Yeah. First of all, if we're ever going to actually have a real recovery, not a stimulus-induced temporary high, it's going to have to be led by manufacturing. The problem is that manufacturing has declined so much because of government policy. We now have more people who work for government than who work in manufacturing. And the reason we've been able to get away with this is because the world has taken the money we print in exchange for the stuff they produce. We run enormous trade deficits because the dollar is the reserve currency, but we've abused that privilege and we're going to lose it. And when the dollar plunges, Americans are going to only be able to consume what we produce. Or if we want to import something, we're going to have to export something of equal value, not just money. And then we're going to have a lot of manufacturing. But that's not going to happen unless we have a lot less regulation, a lot less taxes that have helped drive the manufacturers out of business. And it's going to mean that we're going to have to spend a lot less money on things like education and health care and services. We spend too much money. Thanks to all these government subsidies, we waste so much money on education. You think it's, talk about education, we've got kids borrowing $100,000 plus based on government guaranteed student loans to go and get worthless liberal arts degrees that have basically no marketable value, yet when they could be out learning real skills in the real world, but we stick them in these universities. So we can't think, it sounds great politics to say, yeah, we need to spend more money on education. We need to spend a lot less money on education and a lot of other things, because meanwhile we're spending all this money on education and 15% of the population is unemployed, and we have a $50 billion a month trade deficit because no one's making anything.
Now, can I just respond to that real quick?
There you go.
Does anybody know what the H-1N visa is? It's where American industry goes in and asks the Congress for temporary visas for workers to come in because we can't find Americans to do it. You think that's just about picking grapes? It isn't. It's about software programmers. We bring about 1 million a year into the United States because we don't have young people trained enough to take those $40,000 to $50,000 jobs with benefits. But let me
They're
finish.
getting drunk with student loans on fraternity parties studying liberal arts courses. That's why. They're taking humanities and sociology.
And the bottom line is there are tons of 23 and 24-year-olds in every American city who would love to have those jobs, but we didn't educate them well. We didn't show them how to use technology. We didn't train them well. It's not just about spending money. It's not just...
Whose fault is that? Get the government out of it, and they'll get educated properly.
Yeah. They'll get educated.
I think I want to move the conversation a little bit down here geographically.
Whether they are investment advisors or broker-dealers have the same obligations to the investors, and that's something
Peter,
that I think has
your
fallen
tweet.
by
That would
the
most likely force me to close my broker dealership, but that's a whole different subject. But I wanted to get back onto Dodd-Frank, and because I said earlier that the architect of the housing bubble was Greenspan and the ensuing financial crisis, but he did have some help in Congress, and probably his 2 biggest helpers were Chris Dodd and Barney Frank. They're probably the most culpable in the Congress, so I guess it's only fitting that they should have written financial reform, which did nothing to get at the underlying causes of the financial crisis. They actually had a commission in Congress to study why they had a financial crisis. And of course I tried to get them to call me. After all, I've been forecasting it for years. I wrote a book predicting it, but of course they didn't want me to testify. They didn't want somebody that actually predicted the crisis saying why it happened. They were looking for a reason to justify more government involvement. They did nothing in Dodd-Frank to take power away from the Fed. In fact, the Fed got more power. They didn't even touch Fannie and Freddie. In fact, Fannie and Freddie and the FHA are insuring more mortgages now and a greater percentage of the mortgage market than they did before the crisis. So nothing has been prevented. And of course, the bigger problem too is the moral hazard that is implicit in having the FDIC insuring all these banks. If the FDIC didn't insure these banks, they wouldn't have done all this risky stuff because their depositors wouldn't have let them. But since the government created all the moral hazard by telling depositors, hey, put your money in any bank you want because it doesn't matter what they do, because the government's going to bail them out if they fail, that is the problem. And we made it worse. And the financial crisis that's coming is worse because of Dodd-Frank. We haven't prevented it, we've guaranteed it.
I'd like your thoughts on broad capital ownership as a basic means to distribute new wealth, capital assets to promote real economic growth, not just increasing wages as a way to create demand for the purchase of goods and services.
And it isn't about creating demand. You mentioned that earlier. I mean, demand is practically infinite. I mean, people want things. What we need is supply. If we have supply, then we can have legitimate demand because there's something to buy. But until we produce something, it doesn't matter what you want. It's not going to be available to you. And the reason we have a shortage of supply is because we don't have enough production. And what interferes with that? It's regulations, it's taxes, it's bad monetary policy. It's all the things that the government does to interfere with capitalism, which would produce more products, which would create that demand.
I want to bring in a live wire here, which is the teachers' union, which hasn't really been touched. And I think many of us know that the cost of the pensions for the teachers is higher than what's being spent on education. So obviously there's a disconnect there. The question I have is, if we're not looking at that, or should we look at that, if you were given the opportunity to redesign how education would be done in this country, what would it look like? I've heard so far, first, get rid of liberal arts. That's quite extreme. and then I heard, go become a UPS driver or whatever. And I don't really get a comfortable feeling with that solution. So
most of them have liberal arts degrees anyway, though. So.
Well, I'm just saying. I mean, we've got some smart people in this room. What would you do? How would you redesign our educational system? And I just threw in the variable of the teachers' union, if you choose to touch that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a big apple. So you want to take a little.
Well, first of all, I don't think people that work for government should be allowed to unionize. I think if you want to work for the government, you're not part of a union. The whole thing is corrupt from the beginning. They're almost like a terrorist organization. And the biggest losers, of course, are the children who get a lousy education and their parents who often get stuck with the bill. But some of the best things we can do, if we just got rid of government-subsidized student loans or any government-direct loans for higher education, universities would have no choice but to slash their tuitions. And then college would be affordable again. Yes, not everybody would go, but the people who did go would get a decent education, and it wouldn't cost them more. They wouldn't get graduated with a mortgage, but no house. And if we had more competition in K through 12, if we had vouchers, if we had some way so that there was some competition with these government-created monopolies. I mean, whenever you have a government monopoly, it's not going to be efficient. It's not going to deliver a good product. I mean, everything that we get from the free market, such as cell phones or computers or televisions, the quality keeps going up and the price keeps going down. But everything that government gets involved in, the quality goes down and the price goes up.
Thanks, Peter.
How important is low-cost energy in jump-starting the economy? And is the administration doing enough to promote low-cost energy, or are they moving in the opposite direction?
Well, quickly, the biggest problem with the cost of energy right now is not our energy policy, which I don't like. It's our fiscal and our monetary policy. The reason that gasoline is so expensive now is because we're printing all this money to buy government bonds. A lot of people don't realize this, but gasoline production in America is the highest it's been since about 1993. Demand for gasoline is the lowest it's been since like 1997, because so many Americans don't have jobs, they don't need a lot of gas because they don't have to go to work. But the reason that gas is so expensive is because we're printing so much money. And if we keep destroying the value of our money, then the price of gas is going to go up. But if you take a look at the price of gas in terms of real money, back in the 1950s, you could buy a gallon of gasoline for 25 cents. You can still buy a gallon of gasoline full service for 25 cents and get change. The thing is, you need the same quarter because it's made of silver. So when you have real money, prices go down. When you have funny money, when you have fiat money, prices go up. And unfortunately, they're going to go a lot higher, and that is going to further undermine our economy.